It was supposed to be just another morning, the kind you forget by lunchtime. A quiet breeze moved through the sycamores lining the courthouse street, rustling leaves that shimmered in the golden stretch of early sun. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and fresh newspaper ink, and the courthouse steps were beginning to fill with lawyers, clerks, and city officials. Some were adjusting ties, some were lost in their phones. One man, however, was walking with quiet purpose. Nathaniel. Ray didn't stand out much at first glance. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal grey suit that hugged his frame neatly. His tie was navy with fine white stripes, his shoes polished and purposeful. In one hand, he carried a slim black case, and in the other, a reusable mug that still steamed. To the casual eye, he was just another professional heading to another long day. But his eyes told a different story, focused, steady, scanning everything without appearing to look at anything. He parked just 3 blocks from the courthouse, not because he had to, but because he liked the walk. Time to gather his thoughts, breathe, center himself. He had a big case on the docket today, one that could shift policy in 5 states. But for now, it was just footsteps and morning light. Until he reached the crosswalk. That's where the patrol car slid in behind him. Quiet, but not unnoticed. The white sedan eased up to the corner just as Nathaniel reached the curb. He didn't think anything of it at first. Why would he? But then the door opened, and an officer stepped out, not fast, not loud, but with an energy that made people pause. He was younger, mid-30s maybe, with a crew cut and sunglasses still on despite the soft morning light. "Excuse me," the officer called out. "Hold on there a second." Nathaniel paused, calm, composed. "Yes, officer." The man approached with a posture that was more performance than necessity. One hand resting loosely on his belt, the other adjusting his sunglasses as if the moment needed more drama. "Can I ask where you're headed this morning?" Nathaniel blinked. "Steady, to court." The officer looked him up and down. "You a witness or something?" "No," Nathaniel replied evenly. "I'm attending a proceeding." "You work there, yes." There was a beat of silence. "You got ID on you?" "I do," Nathaniel said, already reaching into his coat pockets slowly. No sudden movements, no raised voice, just smooth, clear compliance. He handed over his government ID card. The officer squinted at it but didn't really read it. "Mind telling me what's in the case?" the officer asked, nodding toward the slim briefcase Nathaniel carried. "Legal files," he replied, "confidential." "Right." The officer didn't hand the ID back. Instead, he radioed something in short, clipped words that Nathaniel couldn't quite make out but recognized anyway. He'd heard enough of those calls in his years working justice from the inside out. "Is there a problem?" Nathaniel asked, politely but firmly. "You seem tense," the officer replied. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "I'm not well." "You're avoiding eye contact." "I'm looking directly at you, officer." The cop's jaw flexed. He took off his sunglasses finally and stared harder. "You always this calm when you get stopped?" Nathaniel took a quiet breath. "I don't get stopped, sir." There it was. A flicker of something behind the officer's eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe doubt, maybe discomfort. Whatever it was, it turned quickly into suspicion. "You know, a lot of people would be nervous right now." Nathaniel offered a faint smile. "Maybe that says more about the system than the person." The officer didn't appreciate that. "I'm going to need you to come with me for a few questions." Nathaniel's posture shifted only slightly. Not resistance, just resolution. "Am I being detained?" "You're not free to go," the officer replied quickly. "Then on what grounds am I being held?" "You're acting evasive." Nathaniel raised his eyebrows ever so slightly. "By walking to work, by answering questions like a lawyer." There was a pause, one that felt longer than it was. A few people had started to notice the conversation. A courthouse intern paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. A maintenance worker stopped wheeling his mop bucket. Nathaniel exhaled. Slowly, "Officer, I do believe this is a misunderstanding." The officer took a step forward. "Hands where I can see them." "My hands have been visible the entire time." I said, "I heard you." The officer's hand hovered near his belt again. Not his firearm, just the radio. But the message was clear. Nathaniel didn't move, and that's when the second patrol car pulled up. 2 more officers stepped out. One of them, an older man with gray at his temples, looked at Nathaniel with immediate recognition. His steps slowed. "That's him?" he asked. "Yeah," the first officer said. "Said he's going to court." The older officer looked at the ID still in his partner's hand, then back at Nathaniel. "Did you actually read that?" he asked quietly. The younger officer frowned. "Of course. He says he works here." The older man stepped closer and looked directly at Nathaniel. Then his face changed. "Not fear, not guilt, just understanding. Double quotes, sir. I believe you're scheduled." In courtroom 3, Nathaniel nodded once. I am deeply sorry. This shouldn't have happened." The younger officer looked between them, confused. "Wait, what's going on?" The older officer gave him a sharp glance. "This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Nathaniel Ray. He's the lead federal prosecutor on today's docket." Silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need a microphone, the kind that hums in the gut of everyone who hears it. The younger officer turned pale. "You single quotes wait. I thought." Nathaniel took his ID back, placing it carefully into his coat. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just met the officer's eyes and said calmly, "I would recommend taking a closer look next time. Assumptions have consequences." And with that, he walked past all 3 officers and up the courthouse steps. Every eye watched him go, some stunned, some ashamed, some inspired, but none could look away. He entered courtroom 3 like nothing had happened, because for him, it hadn't just started there. It had started years ago, in moments just like this one, when people underestimated him, misjudged him, or decided who he was based on nothing more than what they could see. Today, however, he had a case to try, one about fairness, one about bias, one that now carried a sharper edge than ever before. And the officer he'd just left behind, he would spend the rest of the morning asking himself how many others he'd misjudged, and how many of them weren't prosecutors. But Nathaniel didn't look back, because he was never the one on trial. The courtroom buzzed with the usual Monday morning murmur, papers shuffling, whispers echoing off marble walls, shoes clicking on polished tile. No one in the gallery had any idea what had just happened 3 minutes earlier outside the courthouse steps. And Nathaniel Ray, the man whose morning had already cracked something deeper than routine, stepped inside as if none of it touched him. He moved with the kind of control that doesn't come from power but from purpose. People noticed, even if they didn't know why. The clerk gave him a nod, the bailiff straightened, and one junior attorney seated at the far left elbowed her colleague slightly. "That's him," she whispered. He placed his briefcase gently on the table, adjusted his notes, and offered a calm glance toward the opposing counsel. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but the weight of something unseen hung in the air as if the courtroom, without knowing it, had sensed a shift before the gavel ever fell. But this part of Nathaniel's story didn't begin on courthouse steps or in holding cells. It began much earlier, in the narrow hallway of a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit, where the walls were thin, the fridge was often empty, and the only certainty was the sound of his mother's voice reading him case studies instead of bedtime stories. His mother, Clarice Ray, was a paralegal by day and a student by night. After losing her husband in a factory collapse, she raised Nathaniel alone, fueled by quiet fire and legal pads full of handwritten dreams. She couldn't afford a nanny, so Nathaniel often sat at the back of her night classes, coloring between the lines of law books, while professors lectured on due process and equal protection. By the time he was 10, he could quote the Miranda warning from memory. By 12, he understood what it meant to be overpoliced and overlooked. He'd been followed in convenience stores, called out in classrooms for speaking too confidently, and ignored when he raised his hand just a little too often. But he didn't stop raising it. He learned early that power didn't always come from authority. It came from knowing your rights when others didn't think you had any. In high school, he started a peer legal club, helping students draft letters, file appeals for unjust suspensions, and walk through the bureaucratic mazes no one else bothered to explain to them. His guidance counselor told him he was too serious for his age. Nathaniel didn't disagree. Seriousness was survival. College came with its own subtle slights in classrooms, professors who mistook him for an athlete, internships that passed him over with apologetic smiles. But Nathaniel kept showing up, and showing them. He graduated top of his class in political science, then earned his JD with honors from Columbia Law. His thesis, Systemic Blindness, Legal Remedies for Racial Misidentification in Law Enforcement. But none of the grades, degrees, or praise could insulate him from mornings like the one he'd just had. Because no matter how high you climb, Some people will still try to place you back in the box they're more comfortable seeing you in, and yet, he didn't let that bitterness grow roots. He turned it into fuel. That's what had brought him to this courtroom today, not just to try a case, but to shift the ground it stood on. As the judge entered, the room rose. Nathaniel's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and direct, but behind it lived 1,000 stories, and one officer, standing just outside the courtroom doors, still trying to piece together the morning's events, was now listening. He had followed Nathaniel into the building not out of authority, but out of something else, uncertainty, regret, maybe even awakening, because for the first time, Officer Daniels wasn't sure he had been doing his job the way he thought he was. He'd always considered himself fair, never used crude words, never escalated when he didn't have to, but this morning, he hadn't needed to say anything wrong for something to be deeply wrong. He realized what had disturbed him most wasn't the fact that Nathaniel had turned out to be a federal prosecutor. It was how Nathaniel had stayed composed, collected, in complete control, not because he was afraid, but because he had known this moment would come, and he had been preparing for it, his entire life. That shook something in Daniels, not fear, not guilt, something harder to admit, respect. Back inside, Nathaniel's opening argument flowed with quiet passion. No anger, no theatrics, just truth, delivered like a man who knew the weight of being doubted and still chose to believe in justice anyway. Every word was measured, every pause intentional. And across the room, even the defense attorney leaned back slightly, realizing this wouldn't be just another day in court. Something had shifted, and no one knew it yet, but this case, this day, this man, was about to ignite a conversation far beyond courtroom walls, because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one that speaks as if the world is finally ready to listen. The courtroom had never felt so still. It wasn't silence, it was something deeper, collective attention that hung in the air like breath, waiting to be exhaled. Nathaniel Ray had just finished the first part of his argument, and no one could quite return to normal afterward. Even the court reporter had momentarily stopped typing, her eyes caught somewhere between disbelief and admiration. What struck everyone wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. As if truth wasn't something to be proven, but remembered. As if justice wasn't a theory but a promise long overdue. Officer Daniels stood just inside the back doors now, out of uniform. He had slipped into the room, unsure whether he was there to defend himself or understand something he hadn't seen before. His badge sat in his locker 2 floors down, but the weight of it still pressed against his chest like memory. He watched Nathaniel from the back of the courtroom, not with suspicion, not even curiosity, but with the uneasy respect a man feels when standing in the presence of something larger than himself. Daniels wasn't proud of what had happened outside, but shame wasn't the whole story either. What he felt now was a kind of unfamiliar honesty, the kind that made a man question not just what he did, but what he believed about the world. And then it happened. Nathaniel's next move wasn't legal, it was personal. He picked up a photograph from the folder in front of him, one worn at the corners, folded once in the middle. Without a word, he walked it over to the clerk, who passed it up to the judge. "I'd like to submit this into evidence," he said quietly. "It's not official, not in the way this courtroom usually recognizes, but it's the reason I stand here today." The judge raised an eyebrow, unfolded the photograph, and studied it for a long moment. It was a picture of a small boy, scraped, tie crooked, standing next to a woman in a modest dress holding a worn briefcase. The caption on the back, written in faded pen, simply read, "First day at Mom's night class. We both learned something." The judge didn't smile, but something softened in his posture. Nathaniel returned to the stand. "I'm not showing you that picture for sympathy," he said, voice clear. "I'm showing it to remind us what justice looks like at the very beginning, when it's just hope and someone trying to learn the rules of a game they were never invited to play." He let the silence speak for a moment. Then he turned, slowly, to the gallery. "Many of you don't know what it's like to be mistaken for less, to be seen not for who you are, but for who someone expects you to be." That photo, that child grew up learning the difference between what's written in the law and what's practiced on the street. Officer Daniels felt something catch in his throat. Nathaniel didn't point fingers. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. What he offered was bigger than blame. It was reflection. "Some people believe the system is broken," Nathaniel continued, "but I believe it's incomplete. It's missing the voices of those who never got the chance to shape it. A woman in the front row, mid-60s, wiped her eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. She didn't know Nathaniel personally, but she knew the story. It was a version of her own. One lived by neighbors, friends, and brothers. Ones who hadn't made it to this room. Ones who had been judged long before the courtroom doors ever opened. Nathaniel glanced toward the jury. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to ask, what if we've been thinking the wrong way for too long? The question landed heavy, and then something unexpected happened. A man stood up from the back of the courtroom. It was Officer Daniels. People turned. The judge raised his gavel, but Daniels spoke first. Your Honor, he said with steady humility, may I speak? The courtroom froze. Judges don't usually allow interruptions, especially from those not directly involved in the case. But the judge, who had sensed something shifting for the last 20 minutes, nodded once. Daniels stepped forward slowly. No uniform, no shield, just a man trying to put something right. I was the officer who detained Mr. Ray this morning, he said. I didn't know who he was. That's not the problem. The problem is, I didn't ask. I assumed. Gasps moved through the room like wind through a wheat field. Daniels took a breath. He never raised his voice, never resisted. But I treated him like someone he wasn't, not because of what he did, but because of what I expected. Nathaniel said nothing, just listened. Daniels looked at the jury. We all wear things we don't speak about. I wear a badge, he wears a suit. But this morning, the only thing I saw was the color of his skin, and that's something I have to live with. He turned to Nathaniel. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell the truth, not for him, for all the ones who never got to explain. And then he sat down. No applause, no outburst, just silence, thick, echoing because something had just happened that the courtroom rarely witnessed. Accountability, unscripted, real. Nathaniel walked back to his seat, expression unreadable, eyes focused ahead, and for the first time that day it was clear this wasn't just a trial, it was a turning point. A quiet one, maybe, but those are the ones that last. The ripple hadn't stopped by the next morning. Whispers of what happened in that courtroom had made their way into coffee shops, legal circles, group chats, and morning briefings. It wasn't the facts of the case that caught fire, it was the moment. The stillness that came after a uniformed man admitted he was wrong, not with pressure or spin, but with something rare. Honesty. Nathaniel Ray, however, didn't have time to dwell on the echoes. He had a job to do on. It wasn't over by the time he stepped into the courtroom again. The gallery was noticeably fuller. Law students filled the back row. A young mother sat near the aisle with her son, no older than 10, in a crisp white shirt and a tie slightly too big for him. A man from a local newspaper clutched a notepad, unsure whether he was covering a legal proceeding or witnessing history. The judge called the court to order, but something unspoken had shifted. Respect no longer clung only to the robot, now flowed toward the man standing behind the prosecutor's table. A man who wasn't just making a case, but building a bridge, one word at a time. This next portion of the trial wasn't about a single officer's mistake, it was about the law that allowed such mistakes to happen in the first place. Nathaniel turned to the jury and introduced evidence that didn't come in the form of exhibits or expert testimony. He introduced stories, real ones. Meet Jerome Tate. He began, projecting an image onto the screen. College junior, detained outside his dorm because he fit a vague description. Spent 48 hours in holding before someone finally looked at the security footage. Next slide. Angela Rivers, high school teacher, pulled over on her way to work, held for driving suspiciously. Her car, a used sedan with a taillight out. Her crime, being tired and black at 7 a.m. He paused. Let the room sit with that. This isn't about one officer, Nathaniel continued, his voice quiet but unwavering. It's about a pattern, a mindset, a lens that sees threat before it sees humanity. The defense objected once, then again, but the judge allowed it. Not because the stories were easy to hear, but because they were impossible to ignore. And then Nathaniel did something no one expected. He turned the spotlight inward. I've spent years building my career inside a system that wasn't built for people like me, he said. I've won cases, earned titles, spoken at universities, but I've also been followed in stores, questioned on sidewalks, and just yesterday handcuffed on courthouse steps. The room was still again. You see, there's a duality in living this life. On paper, I'm powerful. In practice, I'm suspect. But here's what I've learned. You don't wait for the system to invite you in. You walk in anyway and you make room for others. The judge looked down, brow furrowed not in disapproval, but in thought. The defense attorney looked up, arms folded, trying to find the right time to object again. But something told him not to. Not yet, Nathaniel continued. I'm not here to punish Officer Daniels. I'm here to ask a larger question. When do we stop accepting fear as a filter? When do we stop letting bias wear a badge? Then he paused, don't slowly. He walked toward the jury box. When does justice stop being selective? A juror shifted, another nodded, almost involuntarily. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, doesn't shout. It resonates. Back in the gallery, Officer Daniels sat again, still watching, still thinking. What Nathaniel had done wasn't just hold a mirror up to the court, it was hold a mirror up to him. And unlike most people, Daniels didn't look away. During the short recess, word had reached the chief of police. He had watched the video from the courthouse security cam. No violence, no resistance. Just Nathaniel, composed, questioned without, there would be internal reviews, surely. But more than that, there would be questions. Deep ones. About training, about perception, about power. But for Nathaniel, none of that was the goal. He wasn't here to shame. He was here to shift the narrative, shift the expectations, shift the silence into something louder than words. As the trial resumed, a new witness took the stand, a former police officer turned justice reform advocate. She had once been the only black woman on her precinct's roster. Her testimony wasn't dramatic. It was steady, clear. She spoke of instinct, training, and the moments where assumptions were taught as safety. She ended with one line. We can't fix what we won't face. That line would make headlines later, but in the moment, it did something even more powerful. It made people listen. Nathaniel closed that day with a brief statement. We are not here to divide. We are here to define what fairness actually looks like, not in theory, but in practice. Not for some, but for all. Then he looked around the room, at the jurors, at the judge, at the officer who had once placed him in handcuffs without knowing he was arresting a federal prosecutor. And he smiled just slightly. Not because he had one, but because, finally, the conversation had begun. Rain tapped gently against the courthouse windows. The morning part 5 began, as if the sky itself had slowed down to watch what was unfolding inside. Something was different now. It wasn't just about Nathaniel Ray versus a wrongful detainment. It had become a quiet reckoning, a moment when a community, a city, maybe even a country, was being asked to take a closer look, not just at what happened, but at why it keeps happening. Before court began, the hallway buzzed with unfamiliar energy. Reporters clutched their notebooks with tighter grips, wondering whether today's testimony might become tomorrow's headline. Law students whispered names of case precedents, like sacred texts. A security officer, who usually watched the doors, in silence, leaned a little closer to the courtroom entrance, curious not just about what would be said, but how it would be said. Inside, Nathaniel sat alone at the front table. He wasn't rehearsing, he wasn't reviewing, he was waiting. But this time, he wasn't waiting for justice, he was preparing to become it, because today, he would take the stand, not as a prosecutor, not as a strategist, but as a man who had once believed that if he worked hard enough, respected the rules, and wore the right suit, he could earn the benefit of the doubt. A man who had learned painfully that dignity doesn't always come with a title. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Ray, if you're ready. Nathaniel stood, calm but not cold. His footsteps were even. His breath was measured. As he raised his right hand and took the oath. The room quieted with something close to reverence. And then, with the same steady tone that had silenced objections and disarmed arguments, he began to tell his story. Not the version people assumed, the federal accolades, the courtroom victories, the polished career highlights. No. This story began on a cracked sidewalk in a neighborhood that didn't have curfews. It had unspoken rules. He spoke of his mother, who worked 2 jobs but still made time to iron his shirt before school. Of the night his older cousin was stopped outside a convenience store, and how the incident made Nathaniel keep his hands visible at all times, even when no one was watching. Of the internal decision he made at 14 to become so good, so sharp, so undeniable, that the world would have no choice but to let him in, and for a while, he said, I believed it worked. He paused, there not for effect, but because the truth required space. But yesterday morning reminded me that no title, no tie, no level of education can outpace a person's assumptions, because when I stepped out of my car, I wasn't a federal prosecutor anymore. I was just a black man in the wrong place, with the wrong kind of car, and the wrong kind of confidence. The jury leaned in. He wasn't angry, he wasn't broken, he was resolute. I don't say this to shame. I say it to shift the silence, because that silence, that acceptance of what we've grown used to, is far more dangerous than a bad decision. It creates a pattern, it builds a system, and one day, that system stops seeing people. Nathaniel's eyes moved across the courtroom not as a performance, but as a mirror, and I'm not the exception to a rule. I am proof that the rule exists. A low exhale passed through the gallery, like air escaping from a place that had been holding its breath for too long. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge removed his glasses. Mr. Ray, he said quietly, would you be willing to speak further on record about policy reform? Nathaniel nodded once. I would. Good, the judge said, because the court intends to enter this testimony into public record, not just for the sake of this case, but for future judicial review. It wasn't just a ruling, it was a declaration, and then, as Nathaniel stepped down from the stand, the clerk handed him a folded note passed from the back of the room. He opened it slowly. 6 words. My son wants to be you. No signature, just the echo of something larger than a verdict. After recess, something even more surprising happened. A new motion was filed by Officer Daniels. Not a defense, not an appeal, a formal request for departmental accountability, reviewed by a civilian advisory board, initiated by him, not because anyone forced him, but because the truth, once seen, is hard to unsee, and the burden of change, he had realized, wasn't Nathaniel's to carry alone. As court adjourned that day, the rain had stopped, and in the reflection of the wet pavement outside, the courthouse looked less like a monument, and more like a mirror, a place where, for the first time in a long time, people didn't just hear the law, they felt it. The courtroom was silent as the final day began, not the kind of silence that fills empty rooms, but the heavy, electric stillness that comes just before something changes. Nathaniel Ray didn't walk in like a man approaching the end of a case. He walked in like someone opening a new chapter. Calm, focused, but carrying something different in his posture. Quiet certainty that no matter how today ended, something larger had already begun. The judge took his seat. The jury returned to their box. The cameras, though barred from recording, stared from behind the press gallery, as if hoping they could capture the weight of what had been said across the past week. And then, it was time for closing arguments. The defense went first. Their tone had shifted, no longer defiant, no longer dismissive. The attorney spoke carefully, aware that this wasn't just about clearing an officer's name anymore. It was about proving something human still existed beneath. The mistake. We don't ask you to forget what happened, the defense began. We ask you to remember that people can grow, that systems must be challenged, yes, but that individuals within them can choose to change. It was a subtle appeal, one that leaned on forgiveness rather than denial. Then came turn. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't gesture. He simply stepped forward, stood still, and let the room meet his gaze. You've heard the facts, you've seen the footage, you know what happened that morning, he began. But this case was never just about that morning. It was about every morning like it. Every person who walks into the world, knowing that one misunderstanding, one assumption, one moment of unchecked power could change the course of their life. He paused. Some people don't get a courtroom to explain themselves. Some never get an apology. Some don't get to walk away at all. I was lucky. I had a badge in my briefcase. I had a name in the system. And even with all of that, I was still treated like a suspect. Another pause, not dramatic, just honest. I don't want vengeance, I want vision. A new one, where justice doesn't depend on what you wear, or where you live, or what car you drive. Where your rights come with your birth, not your title. He turned slightly toward the jury. You've been asked to judge one man's decision, but the truth is what you decide today speaks to something much larger. It tells the world whether we still believe in fairness, in accountability, in change. He stepped back. No closing flourish, just truth, placed gently at the feet of those sworn to weigh it. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. When they returned, their foreperson stood slowly and delivered the verdict. Guilty not of criminal brutality or excessive force, but of wrongful detainment based on racial profiling. A rare and specific ruling, one that sent a clear message. Misunderstanding is not a shield when it becomes a pattern. The court didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no dramatic outbursts, just a long, quiet exhale. Justice not loud, not perfect, but real. After court adjourned, Officer Daniels stood outside under the edge of the courthouse steps. He hadn't removed his uniform yet, but the badge seemed to weigh heavier now, not from shame, but from understanding. He waited, and Nathaniel came out, briefcase in hand, coat folded over his arm. Their eyes met, not as enemies, not even as opponents, just as two men changed. I reviewed the footage again, Daniels said quietly. Nathaniel nodded. I saw it differently this time. That's what growth looks like, Nathaniel replied. Seeing the same thing, and realizing it means something new. Daniels hesitated. I'm not the same person I was a week ago. Then don't be, Nathaniel said, and don't stop there. They didn't shake hands. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was something quieter, more lasting. Behind them, the courthouse door swung open, and a flood of people emerged. Not just legal aides and reporters, but teachers, students, everyday citizens who had followed the case from afar and now stood in the presence of something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Nathaniel turned to leave. But before he did, a woman approached him. Late 60s, soft eyes, hands weathered from time and work. She placed a hand on his shoulder. I marched in the 60s, she said. We dreamed of a day like this. Didn't know if we'd ever see it. But today, today felt like the dream remembered itself. He smiled, not because it was over, but because something new was beginning. Later that night, Nathaniel returned to his apartment. He took off his tie, loosened his collar, sat on the edge of his bed, and finally let the weight of the week settle into his chest. Not sorrow, not anger. Gratitude, because the story didn't end in the courtroom. It would live on in classrooms, in policy drafts, in whispered conversations between sons and fathers about what it means to be seen. It would inspire new voices to speak louder, clearer, with less fear. Some victories aren't celebrated with headlines. They're felt in the quiet turning of hearts. And on that evening, with the city lights blinking through his window, Nathaniel Ray didn't feel like he had changed the world. He felt like he had helped it remember how to change.